Hello horror hounds, welcome back to the A to Z of horror, and we are at Q. The clue I gave at the end of the P video was shh, but it's not a quiet place. It's Hammer's The Quiet Ones. Now, the words hammer, horror conjure a whole load of images and feelings, all of them lovely, fuzzy and incredibly welcome, like old friends or a comfortable pair of slippers and a bathrobe. Histrionic orchestral scores, glaring day for night shots of sped up horse-drawn carriages, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Ingrid Pitt and the ever dependable Michael Ripper. Technicolor blood, diaphanous gowns and generous décolletage. But since 2007 a revived Hammer Films has been producing films of variable quality, including Let Me In, Wakewood and The Woman in Black. Our entry for Q is the sixth offering from the Resurrected Hammer Films, whose end of term report card could well read, could do better. Q is for the quiet ones. At this point in the proceedings, my learned friends, I always point you in the direction of Jambo Shango and Randy Mole's excellent YouTube channel, not least because they did the A to Z of horror that inspired me to homage them, rip off. Their entry for Q, I'll provide a link in the description field down below, is for Quarantine, which should lead us nicely into my entry for R. But for now, it's The Quiet Ones. Set in 1974, an Oxford University professor, Professor Copeland, aims to prove that the supernatural does not exist. To that end, he invites a student, Brian McNeil, to document the experiment he has in mind on film, joined by two student assistants, Chrissy and Harry. The subject of the experiment is a troubled young lady called Jane Harper, who believes she is inhabited by a personality called Evie. Is Jane possessed? Is Copeland right in believing that Jane is creating Evie purely through her own telekinetic powers, and thus could hold the key to curing mental illness across the globe? Certainly Copeland's treatments, which he says will help Jane, are questionable at best. Throw into the mix a growing attraction between cameraman Brian and patient Jane, which only adds to his growing suspicions of the professor, as well as sexual and power dynamics flashing backwards and forwards between Chrissy and Harry, as well as Chrissy and the professor, and perhaps even the professor and his patient. And the scene is set for a breakdown of the group and a collision between science and the supernatural, scholarship and faith. The movie opens with the words, "This film is based on actual events." So if you were wondering what that sound was a few days ago, it was me rolling my eyes out of my sockets. And I said to myself, geez, really? The story itself is loosely based on the Canadian Philip experiment, where researchers invented a fictional character and then tried to contact it by seance. It's a really promising setup for a mid-level horror film. The script is by director John Pogue, Oren Moverman and Craig Rosenberg, adapted from an earlier work by Tom DeVille, and I suspect that the list of writers and rewriters may help explain why the film feels like an interesting idea that's been tinkered into something everyone hoped would be more commercial, but ultimately ended up as something more pedestrian. It's a good premise let down by execution. Unfortunately, and all too often, cheap and obvious scares get in the way of something that had the potential to be subtler, more character-driven and creepier as a result. Distorted faces on old film reels and ectoplasmic mouth tentacles bring to mind The Strain more than The Exorcist. So for every successful bit of creep, there's a blunder that loses my goodwill. The period setting really helps it. The 70s setting looks and feels great and gives this movie an identity apart from the slew of other possession movies or sort of found footage experiment movies. The found footage elements recreate the sort of 16mm format from the time really quite nicely. I don't think I could have handled an entire film of it, but Brian's handheld footage gives an authenticity to the proceedings with its retro lens flare, degraded colours and scratchy films. As a documentarian of the experiment though, Brian does seem to spend more time chilling and chatting with the people doing the experiment than actually documenting it. The film has two MVPs, most valuable players. First and foremost, Jared Harris, to my money the best screen Moriarty that I've ever seen in Sherlock Holmes' Game of Shadows. Jared Harris is clearly meant to star in a Hammer film. He relishes playing Copeland as a loose, chain-smoking patrician whose self-belief excuses a complete lack of ethical consideration in his experiments and his treatment of a sick young woman. He acts as if this were the 70s and there's a cigar and a tumbler of whiskey waiting for him just out of shot in every scene. It's not a hammy performance, which is something that's levelled at a lot of old school Hammer films. Rather, as with his predecessors, he's able to roll some of the rather plummy dialogue around his mouth with verve rather than camp. It's a role that Peter Cushing would have owned back in the day. Next up is Olivia Cooke, who's excellent as Jane, the troubled young woman. She plays a fine line between victim and villain. Is she mentally ill or is she possessed? Her performance, coupled with Harris's insistence that the experiment must continue at any cost, will at least hook you enough to watch to the end. It's just that when everything's said and done, the story being told isn't allowed the space to play out between the characters, but hampered by some unnecessary whistles and bells that I just wish they'd stripped back on. In the next instalment of My A to Z of Horror, we'll move from a film which dabbles with the found footage formula to one which is an out-and-out found footage movie, and in my opinion is possibly, maybe, could well be the greatest found footage movie ever made. Join me next time, why don't you, when we reveal that R is for